Okay, so we have about an hour actually. So the way I want to do this is going to start off with a couple of questions for the panel from me, but then of course the really interesting part will be to open it up to you guys, and you can ask questions to the panel as a whole, or also follow up with individual points to each of our wonderful speakers as well. So the first question I'd like to start with, this day has been about perception in all its glory. And what's striking is the range of different systems that have been talked about. So from each of you, I'd like you just to tell us, in the context of your own work, what perception and sensation mean to you. And I want to start with Paul, and maybe Paul, you can also just give us a little intro, very informal little intro about the work that you do.
Yeah, okay, so yeah, it's nice to piggyback on the day's event and get a little glory at the end. So I'm interested in the animal cognition in general, but most of my work has been on perception and control of behavior in insects, and specifically tasks like navigation, where we see striking similarities all across the animal kingdom. And one of the themes I noted today was attempts to bridge not just across the animal kingdom, but across the whole kingdoms of life in the concepts and the ideas that we talk about. But specifically for me, I think I would just steal some words that actually came from Daniel's talk earlier, is that everything I think about is this idea of the inability to separate out perception and action, and therefore I'm thinking about perception in terms of what it allows you to do and what behaviors are permissible, and so that leads into kind of a loop, I suppose, the classic active sense we saw really beautifully, not just in animals but also in cells. And so it's not so much a definition of perception, it's more of the way in which I think of perception as I'm studying it, I suppose.
Katie?
Yeah, so working at the cell level, I think we end up having to be really careful about how we use the terms sensing and perception, essentially to the level of not using the word perception, because biologists, cell biologists can be quite traditional and don't really like human-level words.
Yeah, this is a safe space. You can use whatever words you want.
I know, and this is why it's great, being somewhere like this, because, and you were sort of talking about this a bit, the reluctant scientists, because when you go to like really hardcore biology conferences, you've got to be really careful how you describe what you're really working on, which is this stuff. And coming from a perception action, background, that's very natural to me but maybe that's part of the reason they do this. I think it's important that I will project that on the system, perhaps because I've been trained to think about things in terms of perception action, but it doesn't mean it's really there. So it's a safer thing in the traditional biology world to just talk about sensation and motor response and things. So I've been framing it in terms of sensory motor coordination, but really thinking it's probably perception. So I was looking up the definition of perception actually whilst here, thinking, what do people really think it means? So there's two definitions actually if you just Google it quickly, and one is it's just basically something you get through your senses, and then the other one is about understanding. And I think that's the bigger one, isn't it? And that's the one that the cell biologists find tricky. So has the cell understood something about its world? And then you could call that perception. And that's the bit, obviously it's difficult to measure that. But so just to sort of, so I would break it down as the receptor activation on the cell surface is sensing, and it's very specific. It's a sensor activating. But if you remember that diagram I showed right at the end, the classic biological pathways, because biologists love signaling pathways, basically, so it was all signaling pathways. But they are interconnected networks, and there are hubs in them, in the signaling networks. There are these key molecular players that act as hubs in a network, and they then kick off certain specific gene expression changes. And for me, that's where perception could actually be. So it's not at the receptor sensing level, but it's something further down when it starts to integrate all the different sensors that have activated all at once, because there's actually lots of crosstalk between the different receptors. There's lots of different signals coming in. So the cell has to presumably integrate all of that information into an understanding of, I should respond with this response. You know what I mean? So for me, there is room in cells for perception. Okay.
Great, thank you. Alex?
I will not try to provide any kind of definitions or perspectives on definitions. But in my work and in the goals of the research we do, one element is to try and embrace the chaotic and far-ranging nature of perception and sensing that occurs in naturally complex environments. I think this is a challenge that we avoid necessarily often in the sciences, to minimize confounding factors, to try and understand linear input-output kind of relationships. But what I come to realize in the practice of working in the wild and in challenging conditions is that we are greatly challenged in understanding what might be being sensed or perceived in our focal animals by limitations, as actually one of the questions that we had earlier, by focusing on the visual for reasons that, you know, we are primarily visual animals, and much of our equipment is based on visual input. But in understanding that we can't even accurately predict what an animal is responding to, for instance, if it behaves in a certain way in a natural context, you start to perhaps question whether animals or even other organisms are consciously aware of what they're perceiving, in a sense. And this point about understanding is a very interesting one and challenging one, because I would say a lot of the responses, the behavioral responses that we might be observing in our study organisms and maybe in ourselves are not driven by an understanding of what we've perceived at all, but we are influenced nonetheless, perhaps by things we're not, I mean, certainly, as we know in human studies, certainly by things we're not even consciously aware that we're perceiving. So I think that would be my take on it, that there is a world that these things we study exist in, and we must be conscious of the limitations in ourselves as the observers, but also in the focal organisms, in what parts of, let's say, an adaptive landscape or a sensory landscape that they actually have access to, either in a conscious or a subconscious way.
Right, I'm not sure I'm glad, but thank you for dropping the C word in there already. I was going to come to that a bit later, just noting how controversial perception by itself can be in some contexts. But we're going to get to that, you know, whether these cells in blood vessels can be conscious too. But before going that far, Danny.
Well, I really have trouble with the word perception, because I'm highly instrumental in my approach to life, and about 15 years ago, I put in a grant proposal where I referred to the way in which poultry chicks perceive the world, and I was told by somebody on the panel, a well-known Oxford professor of ethology, that he didn't know what perception meant, and so he wasn't going to fund the grant. And, thereafter, I've avoided using it. I don't quite know what it means. There's textbooks in psychology that distinguish between sensation and perception, and I understood sensation to be one's raw experience of a sensory stimulus, sometimes referred to as qualia, and perception is how one's beginning to build these sensory experiences into some sort of internal model of the world, but probably comes from William James or someone like that, and I don't know more about it. Otherwise, as Paul says, there's a traditional distinction between perception and action, which is highly problematic, that we find quite a lot in the psychology literature. So it's a word I don't use very much until I came to this meeting. Okay, well, I don't know whether you've been persuaded to use it more now, having listened to all these talks. I mean, so I know we don't want to get too hung up on definitions, but let me offer one distinction to see whether that lands. And the distinction
that often comes to my mind when thinking especially about the human case and mammals, which I'm more familiar with, is that sensation might be sensitivity to some stimulus in the environment by some sort of maybe adaptive rule, something like that. But indeed, I think as has been mentioned, the idea of perception suggests something more. It's, as Katie, as you said, it's something to do with, and it's something to do with understanding. It's interpretation. It's going beyond the information in the raw sensory signal in some way. In the human case, we often think about perception as sort of some understanding of the causal basis of the signals that come in rather than just the response to the signal. And so one thing that always comes to my mind is that as you sort of unravel the circuits that are involved, what we might think of perception just becomes some more complicated form of sensation. So just wondering how this lands with you, and here I'm not going to go through in order anymore. I just want people to jump in and maybe come back on each other's points as well in this whole thing, because I know it's a word that causes some discomfort, but this is what the symposium's about, so we're going to get to the bottom of it. How does sensation and perception, in that view that I've suggested, how does that sit with you?
So you're saying that in perception you're beginning to build a model of the world, so it's like an intermediate stage to what I understand as a cognitive representation.
Yeah, you can take it like that.
That we didn't like in the good old days at Sussex.
I was going to say that the idea of internal representation.
Times have changed, Katie.
They do seem to have changed, yeah. I was definitely taught not to use that phrase. But I mean, I think it certainly resonates with me with the way that if you start looking at the complexity of these internal signaling chemical reactions and networks that are triggered by the initial sensation, it's almost exactly like the sort of drawings of a brain network, neural network with lots of inputs and then the same. So I think if you're drawing conclusions like that from that system, you must be able to draw them of the networks going on inside a cell. Yeah, I think it's reasonable. Whether it's true, I don't know, but it's reasonable to see it like that, I think.
Yeah, so I was just trying to think of a way to bridge Anil's more kind of human-centered language on the distinction between the two versus the really interesting ideas that Katie was developing as to where she thinks perception is in the cell. And I guess, I don't know if there's some way where you could look at the level of the system that you're studying and think, well, if I was in the first layer of the visual system, for instance, I would start with the physics of the input. I would be thinking about what's out there in the world, and that would be my starting point. But at some point, as you go through, that wouldn't make sense anymore. And all of a sudden, there'd be a point where it would be much more sensible as a scientist to think about what the animal might be trying to do with the information that comes in. So it could be to do with deciding who gets to grow first, or it might be to deciding whether or not the optic flow signal tells me I'm rotating when I didn't want to. And so that would be the transition I think you could see across all sorts of different systems where, it's a very, well, it's kind of a pub-based measure where you would just argue what would you start with if you were studying it there.
Pub-based measure?
I did, yeah. Okay. I was trying to think of the general term for discussions that don't need to be grounded in as much rigour.
Okay.
Yeah. But that would be my way of thinking about it, is that perception is when you're thinking about, because it wouldn't be about building a model of the world, because not all systems do that, but there is an organisation of what the information is used for at some point, which changes your perspective on how you would understand it, I think.
And so just to be clear, what's on the other side of that transition? So when there's no influence of a goal, so yeah, how deep down, how low does that go before something stops being influenced in the way you're suggesting?
I suspect it's something where you would know when you were definitely interested in the transduction of a physical signal, and then at some point you would know that you were driving behaviour, and then you could argue about exactly when that transition happened or whether it was a continuum. But I think at either end you might be comfortable with describing sensation and describing perception, and then in the middle, that's perhaps more difficult, but...
I don't know if this is reasonable, but my mind immediately jumps to this problem that we tackle, which is the question of whether a spider's web is part of its sensory system, whether the fact that it creates and can tune the silk to be sensitive or less sensitive to certain frequencies, therefore makes it part of its sensory system. And that, in a way, allows me to think about this question, because the web itself is responding to all vibrations that it can transmit, but it can be changed to ignore some frequencies or amplify some frequencies. And then the spider itself sits on that web and has seismic sensing organs, which are also tuned to block out wind, for example. So it's not behaviorally responding to these not irrelevant in its goals. It's not, it hasn't been selected for, and it does not want, in some sense, to respond to these things. And so, in a way, the web and the spider are sensing things that are not perceived through the mechanical nature of the animal and of the web itself. And this, I would use it as some example of how I think about this distinction of sensing being perhaps all of the information that's kind of hitting the sensor, and then the perception being the channels that are accepted through. And that doesn't invoke understanding or consciousness.
Yeah.
I like that extended mind idea that you bring up there with the web.
Yeah, I mean, that recalls actually another of our Sussex colleagues, Andy Clark, who talked about the extended mind, but I think many of his examples talk about memory on your phone and things like this, but yeah, the spider's web being an extended sensory aspect of the mind makes a lot of sense. So do you think then there's a sort of danger of using these terms like sensation and perception, because they connote things that are very hard to dissociate from their anchoring in our human experience? We think of sensation, as you said, we sort of think of sensory experience sometimes, and we think of perception as understanding. So is it a mistake to try and use the same vocabulary to unify all these different phenomena that you've described? Is it too general?
I think it's a really good idea, because it forces you to have to see the links and the unification and the differences, but it has to be defined at first use, and then you're all right. I think, and just thinking about talking to the cell biologists, if I say, look, perception, by which I mean this specifically, which is the way it's used in this system, I can see in this system. You can link it up, and it's really clear. But if you just say it feels like the cell's perceiving, and you don't define what you mean, then you just can get lost in that person's view of what perception means is different to that person's in the audience, and so already you've not really spoken to everyone. But I really agree with trying to see these similarities across scales. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's dangerous as long as it's clear what you mean.
Yeah, one thing that struck me about your presentation, right at the end, you mentioned it already, this diagram of cell signaling, which, as you explained it, just maps straight onto the old sense, think, act thing from cognitive science, which and it hadn't occurred to me that they may be falling into the same kind of
exactly
fallacy
the same
of simplification.
history of problems. Yeah, so I've actually realised that. So when I talk to psychologists that are from the sort of classical cognitive psychology, and they don't really get embodiment, right? And then because it's always input, decision, output, behaviour. And I realised when I started talking to biologists, that's how they view the world. They haven't made that paradigm shift quite yet. But some people have, but it's not often. And then I've presented this at biology conferences, and then I see. The action's first. Because it is quicker. It's just, it has to be first. And then it leaves room for it to inform the decision with movement and with behaviour.
So what would be, taking it the other direction now, what would be the implications from what you study for our understanding of human sensation and perception? Anybody want to take that? I just thought of it. I haven't prepared these questions.
I would riff on something you said in your introduction, which is that we each have a subjective experience that is differentiated and diverse. And I think the more we study diverse forms of life and see how they interface with the world. It just reinforces this idea that there is no single, well, definition, but there is also no single phenomenon that we're describing. They can be grouped and differentiated at some level of discretion or sensitivity as you wish, but I'm continually reminded as we study different organisms of the diversity of experiences, and I think that just reinforces and validates the diversity of experiences that we find in humans.
Yes, I mean, only so far as Darwin replaced a worldview of, at least a sort of Christian Western worldview of Earth created by God for the benefit of human senses and indeed aesthetics, with one that evolved under natural selection with the beauty of birds and butterflies and flowers and so on, not to mention, you know, landscapes and things that you were talking about. You know, having come through evolution and natural selection, what's remarkable, you know, was a big problem to Darwin, because he couldn't then easily explain these similarities that we also heard from Lucia's talk as well. And I think that much of the way in which we perceive the world and act in it and so on, and the way that our sensory systems are set up, indeed, is constrained by the structure of the world that we have and that other organisms have, and it's much is shared. And so there are different Umwelts, of course, but not maybe as different as we might imagine.
Or can imagine. I mean, you mentioned that the examples you give, landscapes, butterflies, birds, these are beautiful to us, but presumably they're not beautiful to a spider. And so I wonder how much of the commonality we see is filtered through our own perceptory limitations.
Yes, it only goes so far. I mean,
this reminds me, I don't know whether any of you have read, or any of you in the audience have read Ed Yong's book, recent book, An Immense World. It's a phenomenal book, I think. He's a great writer, and he starts off with this scenario of, I think it's a barn or something. And I'm trying to remember now, there's a large animal in the barn, maybe it's a horse or something, and there's a mosquito, and there's an owl, and there's a bat, and they're all sort of doing their thing, and he just plays out how this common shared objective reality might appear differently to the bat, obviously echolocating around, the mouse sensing carbon dioxide levels or something, or whether it's safe to be out there. And it just maybe it's the extreme point of Umwelt diversity that it's showing for something apparently so simple, how radically different the Umwelts can be. Now I'm going to just ask a couple more questions, and I want to open it up to the audience. And the next one, and they're related, but my interest is in consciousness. And so I can't resist the opportunity now to, having provoked a little bit with perception. So really, if we're talking about perception in all these contexts, to what extent do you think the system that you're studying has actual experiences associated with its perception or sensation? What can we know about the extent of consciousness when we go far away from the human, as far away as even a single cell in a blood vessel, or a plant, as Paco Calvo was saying, or a xenobot, as Mike Levin's beautiful talk illustrated? How wide is the circle of consciousness? Danny.
So I don't know very much about consciousness. I think one can take a kind of adaptive functional approach to consciousness and say, what is it useful for? and then perhaps make some progress. So if you're reflecting on your mental representations or your state of being, and that has some adaptive purpose, then you can begin to see how one might investigate consciousness in these systems. I think that's about as much as I'm prepared to say.
Okay,
Maybe that's nothing at all, but definitely a functional approach is a way forward.
Okay, but so given your functional approach to cuttlefish, what do you think about cuttlefish? Does anything you've seen there about their behavior, their extraordinary abilities in camouflage, does that suggest to you that there's any conscious experience happening, or is it just not something you can address with those kinds of tools and experiments?
Not in the type of work that we do with them, and I think that the sort of behaviours I was talking about, although they are very rich in the senses that I talked about, there's a high degree of power, many degrees of freedom, millions of motor neurons, and all the rest of it. Actually, this is a system that is probably doesn't need to invoke much in the way of the sort of functional consciousness that we've talked about. Having said that, there's other work done on cephalopods, including by Nicky Clayton, I think, where that may become much more relevant. So I just don't do that work myself, and I don't really know much about the studies that are done.
Alex, I mean, you talked about fish mirror self-recognition, so you have a view on this?
I have a view, but I suppose in line with what we discussed earlier, I think these terms are very useful because of how ambiguous they often are, or the different interpretations of the term, you need in a scientific realm, but also in just a sort of intellectual exchange, to set some boundaries or provide your own definition. And so I would say that if consciousness is the perceived subjective experience of an individual, then of course, no question. That's almost a useless definition because it goes all the way. But if consciousness is, for example, that you experience something and you integrate that experience into previous experiences, and then act upon your interpretation of that experience in light of other experiences you've had. This is a workable hypothesis to test, and then absolutely, fish do this. I can reel off, trivia, but they can remember fights they've had with individuals for 5 days, and then they apparently forget those fights and retest the boundaries. Now, whether that's actually forgetting or it's just adaptive retesting of social relationships is a question. And I mean, any kind of learning, which of course many organisms can do, is in a way setting current experience against integrated previous experience. Now, if that's consciousness, then yes. And so you see, I'm completely dodging the question by defining something away.
No, but I think what you bring to the surface is important, as Danny did, that it is a word that means different things to different people. So I didn't offer my own definition because I didn't want to put you in a straitjacket about it, but I think it's useful to do exactly that. And so on your definition, and so let me actually wrap the final question in, and Danny, feel free to come back on it as well, is whether, because these two things often go together, but I've also been wondering about the ethical implications of the work that's been described here. The extent to which knowing about the surprising sensory and perceptual abilities of the systems that you've explored carry any ethical implications. The fish case, there's been an active debate about, for instance, whether fish consciously feel pain or not, because fish have, as you know much better than me, lagged behind in animal welfare treatment compared to many other creatures that have similarly sophisticated behavior. So maybe you want to speak a little bit to the ethical question too. Yeah,
I actually had a conversation just outside in the break about about this fact that fish are one of the few wild hunted animals that we regularly eat. And the way we hunt them and kill them is horrific. I mean, they are dragged up out of the depths. Their swim bladders expand. Their organs are pushed. I mean, it gets quite graphic. They're terrified. They feel fear. We know these things because they avoid fearful situations. And then they're dumped out on a boat's deck to suffocate in fear and agony. I mean, this is the reality of it. But because fish don't have directed gaze, foveated regions, they don't have faces that we can sort of empathize with, it's easy, I think, to ignore that in a completely non-scientific, non-factual way. It's just this intuitive sense, well, they don't look like there's much going on inside their heads. And I can stand up and give, lists of all the things that they can do and feel and experience, and it just doesn't hit. And honestly, and this might sound strange, that's okay. Because our decisions about the ways we treat things are our own. And if we decide that these animals are not as deserving of compassion as others, if that's your perspective, then I don't know that factual things can, well, I don't believe what I'm saying, actually, now that I say it. I think you should care, but I understand that people don't.
Right.
I just find it quite bizarre that there's conversations about whether hamsters in Switzerland can be kept as single pets or need to be kept in pairs because they're social animals, while we happily massacre tuna. I mean, these things just don't line up in any
There's
universe.
a radical inconsistency, isn't there, to our ethical concerns here. But I think there's a really interesting point about the lack of directed gaze. Whatever the ground truth of fish consciousness is, our natural affinity to attribute it, it's interesting to delineate the factors at play there.
Can I just ask you a question then? So,
is that how it works?
Jeremy Bentham, who, really set out the question of animal welfare well, when he said the question is not can they reason, can they speak, but can they suffer? And I've actually worked quite extensively on the question of cephalopod welfare, because it was required under changes for the law. We had to come up with best practice for cephalopod welfare, so scientists could then be compliant with it. So we were setting the rules of our own game, whatever one may think about that. And I completely agree with what you say, Alex. So there's an excellent book by Victoria Braithwaite, who sadly died 3 or 4 years ago, on Can Fish Feel Pain, where she sort of goes through the evidence and this nice work on crustaceans and so on. But the question to you is, what's the relationship between suffering and consciousness? And then we get to the really problematic issue as to whether there's different levels of suffering. So we might, one of Paul's ants or some Drosophila or something like that, say, well, they only have a lower level of consciousness, so they only have a lower level of suffering, so we can do things to them that we prefer not to do to a mouse or a chimpanzee.
It's a very good question. I mean, I think there's at least two things to unpack in it. One is the last point about are there different levels of suffering, and to my mind, I think there could very well be, not so much necessarily in intensity, but in the situations that might invoke it. So, for instance, if an organism has the ability to engage in mental time travel, then it can anticipate future suffering in a way that animals without that cognitive capacity cannot. It's like the difference between being sad and being disappointed and having regret. There was this fascinating paper about whether rats feel regret because of their sort of proactive, or not, they're sort of looking back at a decision that went badly in a way that suggested that they were considering, oh shit, I should have pressed that nose poke thing. So I think there might be different levels, and this does play into animal welfare in the sense that if you're going to raise animals for food, then even if you end up killing them, it matters that you give them a good life in the meantime, because they may not be aware of what's going to happen to them. So I think there could be different levels. But then the key question is, what's the relationship between suffering and pain? Now, I agree with Bentham's sort of foundation of utilitarianism in that statement, but it's like, where in consciousness we often talk about distinctions between conscious and unconscious perception. And in vision, for instance, there's a whole tradition of showing that we can be affected by visual stimuli without that being assimilated into a conscious experience. Whether the same thing goes for pain is very much more controversial, at least as far as I'm aware, even in the human case. We can clearly have pain experiences that don't depend on nociceptor activation, but whether there's such thing as a whole organism pain response that doesn't invoke any subjective experience of pain is I don't know the answer to that. You have all these converging evidence lines, though. In fish, as you were describing, there's all these fascinating experiments of I think you can give fish something that would be activate nociception in fish, and then you put them in tanks, one of which has some analgesic in it, the other doesn't, and they will go to the tank with analgesic in, even if it's barren and just unattractively lit or something. So they will actively seek out at some cost anesthetic. So that doesn't sort of lock the case down. It's just piece of convergent evidence that yes, you see a similarity in that system to a system that we're always extrapolating from the human. And I think this is the fundamental challenge. How far can we extrapolate from the human? And in some cases, we're making our best guesses, and we're applying the precautionary principle in ways that seem somewhat sensible. But the ground keeps shifting. And I think for reasons that, Alex, you were saying, because we don't often realize the reasons we're making the attributions that we're making. So this is why I think this discussion is really potentially ethically important as well. Katie, what about blood vessel cell things?
Blood vessel cell things?
Yes.
Yes. So, so I think algorithmically, generally, just probably being computer science training, and so the sort of predictive processing model that you have, of which I know a small amount about, but not very much, but that they're, and I don't know exactly how it relates to consciousness, but the idea that they need to sense, so organisms have some sort of internal model of how they should be behaving in that moment, and then they'll basically sense to update that model, is my understanding, and they basically are always trying to make a prediction that they then sort of give an error signal to. Am I getting my prediction right about how I should behave? So once I sort of looked at that algorithmically, and then actually looked at that last slide of mine, where you've now put action at the top, and you've got your sensing action loop that improves the quality of sensation, it seems very similar. I have to say that, okay, so I can really see that the cells will be feeling around to get an error signal on their current state, which would be the genetic state of, let's say, how much D they've got. So the delta 4 level is we use it as a readout of who's the one that's selected right now to be the tip cell, and the other ones are basically being suppressed and inhibited by that. And so in our system, I think that idea could make an awful lot of sense, actually. And then that made me have to think, well, what am I saying there? Am I saying that if that's your definition of a conscious system, that it has an internal model and it updates it, over time locally, and could change, because they do change their mind, as I was saying. So when they interchange positions, they literally change their little Umwelt. This cell's now neighboring that one instead of that one. And it will therefore change, when it does its little sensation prodding stuff, it will obviously get a different error signal coming in. And it can, we actually found it has bistable dynamics, this one you have, the Philopodia there, so which means that the current state's actually very robust. It will take quite a big input difference before it will then switch, but when it switches, it's quick. So that's a bistable system. And it has hysteresis, so it's difficult to switch back. It takes a little bit longer to switch back. But basically, as long as they have a perception action cycle and get the right quality of new signal in, then we found they can do this quick decision changing inside in the gene signal. And I don't know, when I started to think about that, I realized that does map quite a lot to your predictive processing idea, I think. And then I guess I'm saying that maybe there's room to call them conscious in that sense then. Yeah.
I mean, just to put I personally don't think that everything that does predictive coding is conscious.
Right.
So
What's the next layer up then from there to make it conscious?
I mean,
what does it need extra?
I'm asking the questions here.
Just so I can understand, really.
I'm trying to. No, I mean, again, there can be many criteria. For me, the predictive processing framework is a good way to explain the differences between different conscious experiences and the why one experience is the way it is and not some other way. Quite what the sufficient conditions are in that framework, I think, is still very much open for question. One hypothesis might be that there's a fully identifiable generative model that's involved in the mechanism, which is not necessarily the case for everything that you can interpret from that perspective. But yeah, I mean, I personally, I would be rather. It would be a challenge to think of as that system as having a conscious experience. It's a super interesting system, but is that just my bias again? Just thinking, okay, well, can't be. Paul, what about the world of insects?
I don't know. I think I'd prefer to talk about it in a slightly different way, which is, we're all scientists sitting on the stage, and many of the audience would be active scientists. I think where is it useful? So, colleagues who I've worked with have tried to make claims for consciousness in insects, and there's a lot of contention in the world of ethics at the moment with people describing very rich behavioural repertoires in honeybees mainly, bumblebees as well. But I think the problem in many of these cases is starting with definitions of things, then trying to find criteria in animals that you can tick off on your list, but it doesn't change our understanding of those animals. So it's the utility of talking about consciousness in bees is zero in my opinion, and the people who've tried to initiate those conversations, it hasn't changed anything about the way that anybody studies those animals. It might help if we thought less about trying to come up with a definition that a bee could tick, and rather think about, we do have a much better understanding of the neural circuitry in insects than we do in most vertebrates. And so some of the building blocks of cognition would be the thing you'd be looking for, rather than this yes or no binary, conscious or not. So I think bees could be useful in the study of consciousness, but to say bees are conscious doesn't help at all. Right. And is certainly, people might argue all day about whether they are or not, but it doesn't help us understand bees or humans or consciousness. But bees do some really cool things that could be considered to be elements of cognition in general, and maybe even consciousness with respect to the predictive coding, models, expectations, and so on. We can see that happening in these nice little circuits that we can hopefully understand. So I would swerve the question because I don't think it's useful from a scientific
perspective. Swerve, though. It's a very elegant swerve.
Yeah, but it's hopefully it's based on the idea of trying to still study something that related. I'm not trying to swerve the topic altogether. I'm trying to swerve that definitional issue.
But I think, I tend to agree. I think if it doesn't, it's a good point that it doesn't seem to make a difference to our understanding of that system to ask that question of it. But
it does change our understanding of the ethics, I think, and that's a totally different debate, and I haven't thought about that as much as other people on the panel, and so I'm not trying to dismiss that debate, and many people out there have got live kind of concerns about issues, experimentation with insects. So I think that's a different debate that I'm not dismissing that.
I was just going to say, it does matter practically because we know, I think, that decapods are about to be brought under protection of animal welfare legislation in this country, and I guess the EU, and this has been due to the work of Robert Elwood and I think somebody whose surname is Birch in the LSE, I can't remember.
Jonathan Birch.
Jonathan Birch. And, they make quite good arguments. They only just missed being included a decade or so ago when cephalopods were brought into this legislation. So the arguments matter in practical terms, and they make quite a serious case. And that's decapods, but I from my own work, I expect Paul would agree with that. If we look at not only at the overall complexity, but also the details of the nervous systems of decapods and insects like Drosophila, there really isn't a meaningful difference between them, either in the brains or in the behaviours. So I don't quite know where we stand with the ethics of Drosophila work, at least legislatively. They've probably got a few years of a fairly easy ride.
I would also just raise the point that I think in the public consciousness, things like the mirror test carry this obscene weight because we think we intuitively understand the way I would pass the mirror test, and therefore that's the way other animals would pass the mirror test. And I hope in my presentation, but also in the work that I've published on the mirror test, I'm always very adamant that this is not a demonstration of self-awareness or self-consciousness in a fish. This is not sufficient evidence, and probably it was never sufficient evidence even in its original instance. But we were happy to accept that it was because it was comfortable. There was a comfortable fit. And now that it's an uncomfortable fit for a lot of people, the idea that fish are self-conscious, then we look back at the test and we say, oh, wait, the test wasn't testing that at all. And I think it speaks to this point that if we want to understand the experience or the form of consciousness of these animals, we have to be very sensitive and careful about how we even pose the question to them, that it reflects something of value both to the organism but also to us as researchers. And something like the mirror test, I think, simply does not do that.
So could you just reflect a little self-critically on what you told us earlier today? Because maybe, it was implied that you had reservations, but how do you interpret what those cleaner wrasse were doing?
Yeah, I'll quickly do it so as not to derail the conversation. It is my opinion that they, through a process of association, learn what the mirror does as a tool, that it reflects the environment that they inhabit. And an important backup test we did was to place a mark somewhere on the body of the animal that it could see directly, and then it elicits the same behavior. They see the mark and they scrape on that part. And now if you put these two things together, self-perception, that I'm aware that I have a body and my body exists in space, and an understanding of what a mirror is, then you can solve the task without any further requirements. So that is my interpretation, that they learn what a mirror does over a period of time, and that's probably very different to the way we approach a mirror. So it's not even the same test. We approach a mirror and may have a fundamental representation of ourselves that exists already, and we know that the mirror shows that to us. We don't have to learn that the mirror is a tool. So I think that's my conclusion.
So I'm sensing the passing of time, and I wanted to give the audience a chance to put questions to the panel in general, to somebody in particular. So is there a roving mic that goes around? I can see a hand there, and then there, and then there. So would you like to go first?
Thank you very much. This question is mainly, I think, for Katie and Anil, but anyone else can weigh in. So we know that the brain perceives lots of things in the outside world, that it is filtering out, like the subconscious is or unconscious is filtering out quite a lot of it, but it perceives it, but it just isn't telling the conscious part of it. At the same time, we have all these processes going on inside our bodies, like the blood cells are repairing themselves or things like that. And so I'm wondering, is the unconscious brain actually helping to coordinate those things and sensing it and whatever, or do these blood cells or other things that are going on in our body essentially have a mind of their own in a way?
The angiogenesis response, if you cut yourself, is completely local. So the brain is not involved, as far as I understand it. It's so you literally mess up the tissue, I guess, in some way, horrible wound, and that's the noise that wounds make. and instantly that tissue starts to get really unhappy and starts to change its gene expression. It senses it's got no oxygen, and raises these growth factors signals locally, and then the blood vessels go, oh, I sense that, and then they'll go over and do it. So absolutely decentralized, the brain's not involved. Yeah.
Do we know about other things? Like, I don't know, we're not aware of our own digestion or like peristalsis or things like that. Is there any indication that the brain is like just silently coordinating that?
Oh yeah, definitely. So I mean, this I think in your case as well, but also in cases like the activity of the gut digestive system, there's a sense in which these parts of the body have a mind of their own, and that their rhythms, their activity can be a bit autonomous, but certainly the brain is sensitive to them. There's really fascinating evidence about gastric brain coupling, that you see brain activity that oscillates in phase and correlation with the activity of the neurons in the gut that coordinate this process of peristalsis. What the functional relevance of that is still unclear, whether it sort of underpins any emotional mood responses. I mean, it's a very sort of active area of what's now called computational psychosomatics, of how somatic processes in the body, underlie psychological processes in the brain. So I think it's a mixture. It's a very interesting area, though.
And I just add to that obviously when you cut yourself, you become aware of it because there are signals going up to the brain with pain receptors and things. But in terms of the healing response, it doesn't require that part locally. Yeah.
Thank you.
So the lady in, did you have a question? Yes, you were next. Yes. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Please don't skewer me, because I feel like I've sort of given the one talk that was like the fuzzy art thing in this whole conference. So forgive me for the fuzzy art question. But there's a lot of things that you've mentioned in this panel, which, by the way, was beyond exciting, which immediately bring me back to certain things and sort of certain ideas and concepts that emerge out of critical and decolonial anthropology. So say, for instance, if you think about the notion of an extended mind and you compare that to the work of someone like Marisol de la Cadena, who talks about sort of self-perception of a particular community in the Andes as like, here's the mountain being and the kind of the person being and the mountain being in correlation to one another and inextricable from one another. If you think about the notion of differential Umwelts, you can think about Eduardo Viveiros de Castro in the Brazilian Amazon, and like the human as a category, as like an index rather than a fixed thing. So it's like, I'm human, jaguar is prey, liquid is beer. For a jaguar is human, human is prey, and blood is beer. That sort of notion. So all of those kind of ideas emerge in different sort of shapes and through different narratives in metaphysics that are quite radically different from the sort of the Western metaphysics that leads to the kinds of experimental scientific work that you're doing right now. Renegade and reluctant and kind of visionary as you all are, in fact are, and I think that's why I was even allowed through the things. But so the question, the roundabout question is there space in experimental science, in experimentally based science, or in some form of collaborative kind of project for the sort of questions that go to the root, as it were, is there space in experimental science for the kinds of questions that the philosophy of science could ask around what the kind of metaphysical, the sort of the assumptions that we make before the assumptions, before we start to even make that research around what those kinds of definition questions that we were talking about, or not? Or did that not make any sense, which is also fine?
I think, well, I mean, my sense of that question was, yes, there has to be, and all good scientists do that either explicitly or implicitly. And my reading of it was that those ideas relate to things like, understanding the ecology within which an organism produces behavior, understanding the needs and requirements of the behaviors and that organisms are trying to produce. That's the broader set of ideas that go around this idea of an Umwelt anyway. And so there will be people in labs who've never considered that, who've worked their entire careers with a mouse or a Drosophila, but everybody who's up here today is kind of probably not thinking that way, and perhaps Katie's work is the best example of that, of thinking outside the box and actually thinking about, what an Umwelt means for a cell. And so I see in the way that lots of people tackle their science, certainly exemplified by the people up here today, that is implicit. Maybe there's a deeper level that we could go to really address it, but I think that speaks to what this panel is about in a way, and the Umwelt is the concept that ties a lot of us to these big ideas.
Yeah, I might just add to that. So I think it's really important to try to step back and think about what your philosophy is and what your framework is that's driving your hypotheses a bit. I suppose that's what I was trying to get to, yeah, that the biological world hasn't really hit on this hypothesis that we came up with because they think from a completely different viewpoint. And so you can, I think you can definitely design experiments to test the philosophical viewpoints, as long as you can formulate a hypothesis. So you say, I'm thinking from this viewpoint, therefore this should happen if I'm correct. And then once you've got a hypothesis, you have a testable scenario, you can create an experiment and really find out. But it's that tricky thing to be able to recognize what the different philosophical views would, what would be the different outcome then, and put that into a hypothesis that's then testable. But I think it's doable, absolutely, and important.
And I would, we talked a bit about the use of the word perception, and whether it's useful. My feeling is it's not actually useful because it has such a different meaning in common language, and that gets back to the point that you're making, that I think a lot of what we're working with is rooted in real human language, and happens to be speaking in English in a certain social context, and so on. And we can't get away from that. And reflecting on the sort of points that you're making can be very, very helpful for understanding those constraints, and perhaps over believing too much in the power of our way of thinking.
I think we had one more question from the front here. Yep. We've got time for maybe one more after this if it's very quick.
I'm not sure what my question is, but I'm just going to start. So perception, Sarah Ahmed says that perception is actually based on your orientation. And so she's talking about it more as a sort of social, it's in queer phenomenology that she's talking about this. So that perception is based on your orientation around a dominant body, for example. And if you are, or you are not part of that dominant body, you have a different perception. So I guess what I'm thinking about through this is if you're talking about an Umwelt and a non-human Umwelt, what is the perception that is coming from this other orientation, which is a non-human orientation? So I guess it's a very different way of maybe thinking about perception. And so what I was thinking about throughout the whole talk actually was about Catherine Hale's Unthought. And instead of talking about consciousness, she talks about cognition. And she says that the non-conscious is actually a much better way of thinking about a distributed cognition, a sort of distributed body of consciousness. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with her work and this book, Unthought. But in your talk, Katie, my kind of conclusion, and I'm not a scientist, by the way, I'm an artist, so I'm talking completely as an artist. But what you were saying in your final slide made me think it's like dance first and think later. And that's what Catherine Hales is talking about, that the non-conscious is a way of thinking about cognition in this distributed and non-human way that is about this action which is much faster than the process of thinking. So consciousness sort of is secondary in a way. So maybe I'm wondering if the non-conscious is a way of asking a question about consciousness to the non-human.
I think you framed that really nicely. And there's a eco-psych, I don't know if people know the eco-psych field, ecological psychology. But anyway, there's a study called the there's a thing called the A not B error, which is where you can put cups in front of children. I did it with my own baby at one point. It was great fun. And you keep putting a ball in one cup, and they see it, and they reach for the cup with the ball, And then after a bit, you put it in the other cup. And they, at a certain age, up to a certain age, they'll still reach for the cup, even though they watched it go in the other. They watched it go in this cup, but it's been going in there, and they've got muscle memory, really. It's about timescales. It's your movement's faster than the thought process. And I think that's exactly right. That's exactly how I think about it with the cells. I think the movement it's primary because it's just faster. It's a localized response. It doesn't go through the central processor. The central processor being gene expression changes, which I think are just slower, just like that thought process, yeah.
Thank you for the question. And I'm afraid we are out of time. So thank you for your questions and for being here. It just remains to me to thank our esteemed panel, Daniel Osorio, Alex Jordan, Katie Bentley, Paul Graham. And also thank you to the organisers of this whole symposium. I mean, all the Lever Hume students, but in particular, Jonathan Royce, George Kafatsis, Will Roseby, and Mikhail Roald Arbol. So thank you very much, guys. And I'm going to just ask the panel to leave and hand the mic over to Mikhail, who's going to close the meeting with a few final remarks.